I remember the exact moment my own son tried to have me declared mentally unstable, and the strangest part is that it didn't start with anger or shouting, it started with $40 million. My name is William Carter, I'm 68 years old, a retired mechanical engineer from Columbus, Ohio, the kind of man who spent 40 years fixing problems with quiet patience and steady hands. For most of my life I believed family worked the same way machines do. If you treat them right and keep things balanced, they hold together. I raised my son Daniel with that belief. When he was a boy, he helped me in the garage on Saturday mornings, holding a flashlight while I changed brake pads on my old pickup truck, asking questions about how everything worked. Back then Daniel was thoughtful, calm, the type of kid who apologized when he made a mistake and stayed late after school to help his classmates with math. He grew up, married a kind woman named Emily, and for years I believed he had built the life I hoped for him. They bought a modest house about 15 miles from mine, hosted Sunday dinners, laughed easily, the sort of marriage neighbors describe as steady. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic. Just ordinary happiness. Then one afternoon last spring everything changed with a single phone call from a law office downtown. A distant relative of ours, my late cousin Arthur Carter, had passed away in Arizona. I hadn't spoken to Arthur in years, and I assumed the call was just about family paperwork or condolences. Instead, the lawyer calmly explained that Arthur had left the majority of his estate to Daniel. The number sounded unreal when he said it out loud. $40 million. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the wall clock while the second hand ticked slowly around the dial, wondering if I had heard him correctly. Daniel couldn't believe it either at first. None of us could. A man goes his whole life expecting to earn every dollar the hard way, and suddenly that kind of money drops into your lap like a thunderstorm on a clear day. At first Daniel seemed grateful. He hugged Emily, promised he would invest wisely, talked about helping family and donating to charities Arthur used to support. But money has a way of revealing parts of people you didn't know were there. Within a few months the changes started small but noticeable. New friends. New lawyers. Meetings he wouldn't explain. The old house wasn't good enough anymore, so he bought a massive place outside the city with a long driveway and security cameras at the gate. When I visited, he seemed distracted, colder somehow, like his thoughts were always somewhere else. Emily noticed it too. The warmth between them faded into tension that filled the room like humidity before a storm. Then one night at nearly 1 a.m. my phone rang. It was Emily, her voice shaking as she told me Daniel had just thrown her out of the house without warning. I drove over immediately, expecting to calm things down, maybe talk some sense into my son. But when I arrived the lights were off and the gate was locked. And that was the moment I began to realize something was deeply wrong with my son. What I didn't know yet was that Daniel had already started telling people a very different story about me. Emily sat in the passenger seat of my old Ford sedan that night with nothing but a small overnight bag on her lap and the kind of silence that tells you someone is still trying to understand what just happened to their life. The streetlight outside my house painted long shadows across the windshield, while the engine idled quietly, and for a few seconds neither of us said a word. Finally she looked at me and asked a question I still remember clearly. "Did Daniel seem different to you lately?" I did not answer right away because the truth was that I had noticed it too, but I had not wanted to believe what it might mean. When your own son changes, you look for reasonable explanations first. Stress. New responsibility. The pressure of money. But as Emily spoke, I began to realize the changes were not temporary moods. They were something deeper. She told me that over the last 2 months Daniel had become obsessed with control. New lawyers started appearing at the house. Financial advisors came and went almost every week. Daniel stopped discussing anything openly and began locking documents in a private office he had built in the new house. The man who used to talk about family dinners now talked about legal structures, liability protection, and something called guardianship planning. At the time, Emily thought it was just part of managing a large inheritance. Wealthy people did things differently. That was the explanation Daniel gave every time she asked questions. But there were small details that did not fit that story. One afternoon she overheard Daniel on the phone speaking to a doctor. Not a medical doctor who treats illness, but a specialist who performs cognitive evaluations. When Emily asked him about it, Daniel brushed it off with a quick smile, and said he was researching long-term planning for the family. Emily said she wanted to believe him. After all, they had been married for 6 years. But something about the conversation stayed with her, the way Daniel spoke quietly and kept glancing toward the hallway like he did not want anyone else to hear. As she told me all of this, I felt a slow uneasiness settle in my chest. I had spent decades working with engineers who taught me one important rule about problems. When small details start contradicting the main explanation, something underneath the surface is not right. I asked Emily one simple question. When did Daniel start talking about guardianship? She thought for a moment, and then answered softly that it began shortly after he met with his new legal team about the inheritance trust. That answer hung in the air between us like a loose thread. I remember leaning back in my seat and staring through the windshield at the quiet street outside my house. Because suddenly a thought crossed my mind that I could not ignore. If Daniel was researching guardianship laws, then someone in the family had to be the subject of that plan. And there were only 2 older members of the Carter family still alive. Emily noticed the expression on my face and asked what I was thinking. I told her honestly that I was not certain yet. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever Daniel had started planning inside that new house was not about protecting the family. It was about controlling it. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, the kind of early where the sky outside the kitchen window is still a dull gray and the neighborhood has not fully started moving yet. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table where my wife and I used to eat breakfast before she passed away 8 years ago. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock above the stove. I remember staring at that clock again, the same way I had the day the lawyer called about the inheritance. Only this time I was not thinking about money. I was thinking about patterns. Engineers spend their lives studying patterns because machines rarely fail without warning signs. They give you small clues first. A vibration that does not belong. A sound that appears out of rhythm. If you ignore those signs long enough, the system eventually collapses. That morning I started laying out the clues in my mind the same way I used to analyze mechanical problems at work. Daniel had inherited $40 million. Shortly after that, he replaced the family lawyer with a new legal team none of us had met before. He had meetings with financial advisors almost every week. Then there was the word Emily mentioned the night before. Guardianship. It is not a word people use casually. In legal terms, guardianship means the court decides someone is no longer capable of making decisions for themselves. Once that happens, another person takes control of their finances, their property, sometimes even where they live. I knew enough about the concept to understand how serious it was. And the more I thought about it, the more one uncomfortable question began to settle into place. Who exactly was Daniel planning to place under guardianship? The Carter family is not large. My cousin Arthur had passed away. My wife was gone. That left only 2 older members of the family who could possibly be considered. And I was one of them. I tried to dismiss the idea at first because accusing your own son of something like that feels unnatural. Parents are wired to protect their children, not suspect them. But the logic would not let go. Daniel had new lawyers. He was speaking to medical professionals who conducted cognitive evaluations. He had started locking documents inside a private office. Those were not random events. They formed a pattern. Around 9 that morning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The name on the screen surprised me. It was Robert Hayes, the attorney who had handled some minor property paperwork for me years earlier. I had not spoken to him in a long time. When I answered the call, his voice sounded unusually cautious, like someone stepping carefully through a conversation. He asked how I had been doing lately, and whether everything was all right with my family. I told him things were mostly quiet. Then there was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to feel deliberate. Finally, Robert said something that made the room feel a little colder. He told me that my son Daniel had contacted his law firm the previous week asking detailed questions about legal guardianship procedures in the state of Ohio. And according to the consultation notes, Daniel had been very specific about the person he believed might soon require supervision. The person he was talking about was me. For a few seconds after Robert said those words, I did not respond because my mind was trying to catch up with what I had just heard. I leaned back in the kitchen chair and looked across the room at the same photographs that had been hanging on the wall for years. There was one of Daniel when he was 8 years old holding a fishing rod twice his height, grinning proudly beside the lake. Another showed him in his college graduation gown with Emily standing beside him, both of them smiling like the future was something simple and bright. It is strange how quickly those memories can begin to feel distant once doubt enters the picture. I finally asked Robert to repeat what he had just said because part of me hoped I had misunderstood the situation. But he did not change a single word. Daniel had contacted his firm and requested information about guardianship proceedings in Ohio. He had asked how quickly a family member could petition the court to declare an elderly parent mentally incapable of managing their affairs. He had also asked about the process for transferring control of financial accounts and property once that declaration was approved. Robert explained that his firm had declined to represent Daniel after the consultation because the questions felt unusually aggressive for what was supposed to be a precautionary discussion. Most families explore guardianship only after clear medical evidence appears. Daniel had been asking about it before any such concerns existed. I thanked Robert for calling me and asked him one more question before we ended the conversation. I asked whether Daniel had mentioned any specific reason for believing I needed supervision. Robert paused briefly, and then told me that Daniel claimed he had noticed recent signs of confusion and forgetfulness in my behavior. When I heard that explanation, I could not help letting out a quiet breath. I am not a perfect man and I certainly forget small things the way most people my age do, but I still balance my checkbook every month and maintain my own home without assistance. Nothing about my daily life suggests I am incapable of making decisions. Yet someone somewhere was being told that story about me. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time thinking about what Robert had revealed. The pieces of the puzzle that had been scattered before were beginning to connect in a way that made the picture much clearer. Daniel had inherited a fortune large enough to change the course of several generations. He had replaced the family lawyer and built a private office inside his new house where no one else could see the documents he was preparing. He had consulted medical professionals about cognitive evaluations and asked legal questions about removing an elderly parent from control of their own life. None of those actions proved anything on their own, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. By the time the coffee in my mug had gone cold, I had reached one quiet conclusion that settled firmly in my mind. My son was not simply changing because of money. He was preparing something carefully, step by step, and if I did not understand that plan soon, I might wake up one morning to find that someone else had already decided what the rest of my life would look like. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house slowly, the way a person does when they are trying to think clearly without letting panic take control. The sunlight had finally begun to fill the kitchen and the quiet neighborhood outside was starting its normal rhythm. A lawn mower started somewhere down the street. A delivery truck rolled past my driveway. Ordinary sounds that reminded me the world had not changed overnight, even if my understanding of my own family had. I poured another cup of coffee and sat back down at the table, this time with a small notepad in front of me. Old habits from my engineering career came back naturally. When a problem seemed complicated, the first step was always to write down what was known and separate it from what was only suspicion. So I began listing the facts carefully. Daniel had inherited $40 million from my cousin Arthur. Within a few months he had replaced the family lawyer and hired a completely new legal team. He had consulted professionals about cognitive evaluations and guardianship laws. And according to Robert Hayes, he had already begun describing me as someone who might be mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. None of those facts were rumors. They came from real conversations and documented consultations. When I finished writing them down, the page looked simple, but the implications were not. Because if Daniel intended to pursue guardianship through the courts, he would need evidence. That meant documentation, professional opinions, and a story that sounded convincing enough for a judge to consider. The realization made me lean back in my chair and stare at the ceiling for a moment. My son was not acting impulsively. Whatever he was doing had structure. And structure means planning. Around noon my phone buzzed again. This time the name on the screen was Emily. Her voice sounded calmer than it had the night before, but there was still a careful tension underneath every word. She told me she had spent the morning thinking about our conversation and remembered something else Daniel had done recently that seemed unusual at the time. About 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had asked her to schedule a routine health appointment for me with a medical clinic he recommended. He said it would be helpful for their long-term family planning and that the clinic specialized in senior wellness evaluations. Emily admitted she thought the suggestion was strange because I had never asked Daniel for help managing my health care. When she told him that, he insisted it was simply a responsible precaution. At the time she believed him. But now the request looked very different. Wellness evaluations can sometimes include cognitive screening tests. Tests that measure memory, attention, and decision-making. The kind of tests that could appear later in a legal petition claiming someone was mentally declining. When Emily finished explaining this, I thanked her quietly, and told her she had done the right thing by sharing every detail she remembered. After the call ended, I looked down at the list on my notepad again, and added one more line beneath the others. Daniel had attempted to arrange a medical evaluation without telling me why. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new piece of information. And by the time the afternoon sun reached the windows in my living room, I had reached another conclusion that felt just as steady as the first one earlier that morning. If my son was preparing a case against me, then the only way to protect myself was to understand every step of the plan before he tried to use it. I did not sleep much that night because once a person begins to see the shape of a problem, it becomes impossible to ignore it. The house was quiet, and the digital clock beside my bed glowed softly in the dark while the hours passed one by one. I kept thinking about Daniel as a boy, about the patience he once had when we worked on small projects together in the garage. Back then he believed every problem could be solved with honesty and careful thinking. Somewhere along the way that belief had changed, and the question that stayed in my mind was when it happened. The next morning I woke up with a clear decision. If Daniel was quietly building a legal case against me, then waiting and hoping the situation would correct itself was not an option. The only responsible thing to do was prepare. Around 8:30 I drove downtown to a modest brick office building where Robert Hayes had practiced law for nearly 20 years. His office looked exactly the way I remembered it from the last time I had visited, shelves of legal books along the walls, framed certificates, and a large window that faced the courthouse across the street. Robert greeted me with a firm handshake and a serious expression that told me he had already been thinking about the situation since our phone call. We sat across from each other at his conference table, and I explained everything Emily had told me about the clinic appointment Daniel had tried to arrange. Robert listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally making small notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together, as if organizing the information in his own mind. Then he said something that confirmed my suspicions more clearly than anything before. In guardianship cases, the person filing the petition often begins by gathering medical opinions that suggest cognitive decline. Those evaluations become the foundation of the legal argument. If Daniel could persuade a doctor to document concerns about my memory or judgment, then he could present that report to a judge as justification for supervision. Robert explained that courts take such claims seriously because they are meant to protect vulnerable people, but the system also relies heavily on the evidence presented by family members. That meant the situation could move quickly if Daniel had already begun collecting supporting documents. Hearing that explanation did not make me angry the way some people might expect. Instead, it made me focus. I asked Robert what the most sensible step would be if someone believed they were about to be falsely declared incapable. He did not hesitate with his answer. Preparation and documentation. He suggested that we begin by assembling a clear record of my financial independence, my medical history, and my daily activities. Evidence that demonstrated I was fully capable of managing my own life. The approach sounded practical and calm, exactly the kind of strategy one respected. Before I left the office, Robert added one final thought that stayed with me during the drive home. He said that when money changes the balance of a family, the legal system sometimes becomes the stage where deeper conflicts appear. His advice was simple. Do not assume the situation will resolve itself. Understand the plan before it unfolds. And as I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, I realized something with complete certainty. My son believed he was preparing quietly. What he did not know yet was that I had already begun preparing too. I have always believed that preparation is not about fighting someone, it is about understanding the ground you are standing on before the storm arrives. Over the next few days I followed Robert Hayes's advice carefully. I gathered bank statements, tax records, property documents, and the paperwork showing that I had been managing my finances independently for years. None of it was dramatic work, just quiet hours at my dining table with folders spread across the surface and a yellow notepad beside me. But the process had a strange effect on my thinking. The more I organized those documents, the calmer I became, because facts have a way of bringing clarity when emotions try to cloud the situation. By Thursday afternoon I had assembled a neat stack of records that told a very simple story. My bills were paid on time, my investments were stable, my home was fully maintained, and there had never been a single medical report suggesting cognitive decline. If someone wanted to claim that I was incapable of managing my life, the evidence would have to come from somewhere else. That evening Emily called again. Her voice sounded stronger now, less uncertain than it had the night Daniel forced her to leave the house. She told me she had spent the last few days staying with a close friend and thinking about everything that had happened. During that time she remembered something important about the documents Daniel had been working on in his private office. Several weeks before the argument that ended their marriage, she had accidentally walked into the room while he was reviewing a large binder with one of his new attorneys. Daniel closed it immediately, but not before she noticed the title printed on the first page. It said Guardianship Petition Draft. When she told me that detail, I felt the same quiet chill I had experienced during Robert's phone call earlier in the week. A draft petition meant Daniel had already begun preparing official paperwork, possibly even outlining claims about my mental state before speaking to any doctor who had actually evaluated me. Emily said she had not understood the significance at the time because she assumed the conversation was about some distant relative who might need assistance. Now she realized the situation had been very different. I thanked her again for sharing the memory and told her she had done more to help than she probably realized. After the call ended, I walked out onto my back porch and watched the sun setting behind the row of maple trees at the end of the street. The evening air was cool and quiet, and for a moment the whole neighborhood looked peaceful enough that no one would ever imagine a family dispute unfolding behind closed doors. Yet the pieces were now clear enough that I could no longer pretend this was only suspicion. My son had already begun drafting the legal foundation for a guardianship case against me. The surprising part was that I did not feel anger standing there on the porch. What I felt instead was a kind of steady focus that comes when a complicated problem finally reveals its true shape. Daniel believed he was quietly building a case that would give him control of my life. What he had not considered was that once you understand a plan, you can begin preparing the response long before the first move is made. The following morning I woke up with the same quiet determination that had settled in my mind the night before. When you understand that someone is preparing a move against you, the worst mistake is pretending the situation will disappear on its own. I made breakfast the same way I had for years, 2 eggs, toast, and black coffee, and while I ate I looked again at the folder Robert Hayes had helped me organize. Inside were bank records, medical reports, property documents, and written notes explaining my daily routines. The evidence did not look dramatic, but it told a consistent story. I was living a stable and independent life. That was the truth, and sometimes truth is the strongest defense a person can have. Around mid-morning I drove back to Robert's office to review the documents together. The courthouse across the street was busy that day, people moving in and out with folders under their arms, each one carrying some story about conflict or resolution. Robert studied the paperwork carefully and nodded with quiet approval. He explained that preparation does not mean assuming the worst, it means making sure facts are ready before someone tries to rewrite them. Then he suggested something else that I had not considered yet. If Daniel was collecting medical opinions to question my mental ability, it might be wise for me to obtain my own independent evaluation from a respected physician. Not because I doubted myself, but because documentation from an unbiased professional could stop a false narrative before it gained momentum. The idea made sense immediately. That afternoon, Robert arranged an appointment for me with a well-regarded neurologist at a medical center about 20 minutes from my home. The clinic was modern and quiet, the kind of place where every hallway smells faintly of disinfectant and fresh paint. The doctor greeted me politely and explained that the evaluation would include memory exercises, problem-solving questions, and basic neurological screening. It was not uncomfortable or invasive, just a structured conversation designed to measure attention and reasoning. When the tests were finished, the doctor smiled and said something that felt reassuringly ordinary. My cognitive results were well within the expected range for someone my age. In fact, he added with a light tone, many people in their 60s and 70s show exactly the same patterns of memory recall and decision-making. I thanked him and left the clinic with a printed summary confirming that nothing about my mental state suggested incapacity. That document went directly into the folder Robert had prepared. Later that evening I sat again on the back porch watching the sky turn soft shades of orange and blue above the quiet neighborhood. The events of the week had changed the way I thought about my own family, but they had also clarified something important. Daniel believed he was building a careful legal argument piece by piece. What he had not realized was that the moment I understood the direction of his plan, I began building a record of my own. And unlike rumors or assumptions, records have a way of speaking very clearly when the time finally comes to present them. I learned something important during the years I worked as an engineer, and it is that the moment you begin documenting a system carefully, the truth tends to reveal itself without much effort. Over the next several days I continued building the record Robert Hayes had suggested. Every morning I followed my usual routine, waking up at 6:30, making breakfast, reading the local newspaper, and taking a short walk around the neighborhood. At first those details might sound ordinary, but that was exactly the point. Ordinary routines show stability. They show a life that is functioning normally, not the kind of confusion someone would expect from a person who supposedly could not manage his own affairs. I wrote those routines down in a simple daily log and added receipts, appointment confirmations, and notes about conversations. Robert explained that small consistent details often matter more in court than dramatic accusations. Judges want to see patterns of behavior over time, not just one person's claims about another. Midweek I returned to his office again so we could review everything together. The folder was becoming thicker now, and when Robert flipped through the pages he nodded slowly with the calm expression of someone who appreciates clear evidence. He reminded me that the legal system does not operate on assumptions. It operates on documents. And right now the documents told a story that was very different from the one Daniel appeared to be preparing. Before I left that meeting, Robert shared another piece of information that caught my attention. According to public court records, Daniel had not filed any official petition yet, but his legal team had recently scheduled a preliminary consultation with a private medical evaluator who sometimes testified in guardianship cases. That meant Daniel was still in the preparation stage, collecting opinions and building a narrative before presenting anything to a judge. Hearing that confirmed something I had suspected from the beginning. Daniel believed he was working quietly and methodically, step by step, without anyone noticing the direction he was heading. What he did not realize was that the moment Robert warned me about the consultation weeks earlier, the situation had already changed. Because preparation works both ways. Later that evening, Emily stopped by my house to drop off a few boxes of belongings she had left in Daniel's garage months before. We sat together at the kitchen table while the late afternoon sunlight filled the room, and for a moment the conversation drifted back to simpler times when the three of us used to share Sunday dinners without tension hanging in the air. Emily told me she still struggled to understand how Daniel had changed so quickly after receiving the inheritance. I told her something I had been thinking about for days. Sometimes money does not transform a person. Sometimes it only reveals who they were becoming all along. The important thing now was not speculation about Daniel's motives. The important thing was making sure that truth remained visible when the moment came for decisions to be made. And by the time Emily left that evening, I had the quiet sense that the situation was moving toward a turning point. Because once preparation on both sides reaches a certain stage, the next step usually happens in public, where every claim must finally stand beside the evidence that supports it. The turning point arrived on a quiet Monday morning when the mail carrier slid a large envelope through the slot in my front door. I knew immediately what. It was before I even picked it up. The return address belonged to a law firm I had never worked with, the same firm Robert Hayes had mentioned during our earlier conversations. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table and opened it carefully, the way you open something when you already understand that the contents will change the tone of the day. Inside was a formal notice informing me that a petition for guardianship had been submitted to the county court. The document stated that my son Daniel Carter believed I was no longer capable of managing my financial and personal affairs due to what he described as progressive cognitive decline. The language was polite and professional, but the implication behind it was unmistakable. Daniel had officially begun the process of asking a judge to place my life under someone else's control. I read the document twice without speaking. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. After a moment I folded the papers neatly and placed them into the folder Robert and I had been building over the past several weeks. Then I picked up the phone and called his office. Robert listened carefully as I read the notice aloud. When I finished, he did not sound surprised. In fact, his voice carried the calm tone of someone who had expected this step all along. He explained that filing the petition meant Daniel believed he had gathered enough preliminary evidence to convince the court to review the claim. The next stage would involve hearings, documentation, and testimony from both sides. I asked Robert what the timeline would look like from this point forward. He told me that the court would likely schedule an initial evaluation within a few weeks. During that time, Daniel's legal team would present their argument explaining why guardianship was necessary. Our responsibility would be to demonstrate that the claim had no factual foundation. In other words, the situation had now moved from quiet preparation into a formal legal process where every statement would have to stand beside real evidence. After we ended the call, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking through the folder again. Bank statements, property records, medical evaluations, daily logs. Everything was organized carefully, page after page of simple facts describing a life that functioned normally. I thought about Daniel. While I turned those pages, somewhere inside his new house he was probably reviewing his own documents with equal confidence, convinced that the story he had constructed would sound persuasive in a courtroom. What neither of us could change now was that the matter would soon be placed in front of people who cared less about family disagreements and more about documented truth. Late that afternoon I stepped outside onto the porch as the sun began dropping toward the horizon. The neighborhood was peaceful, children riding bicycles down the street and neighbors walking their dogs like any ordinary day. But I understood that something significant had shifted. My son had made his move. And the next chapter of this situation would not unfold quietly inside private offices or phone calls anymore. It would unfold in a courtroom where evidence speaks louder than assumptions, and where every claim must eventually face the weight of proof. I arrived at the courthouse 3 weeks later on a gray Thursday morning that felt unusually quiet for the center of the city. The building itself had always looked solid and calm to me, tall stone columns in front and large glass doors that reflected the cloudy sky above the street. Robert Hayes met me inside the lobby with the same steady expression he had carried since the day I first walked into his office about this situation. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a simple reminder that the purpose of the hearing was not to argue emotions but to examine facts. We walked together down a long hallway where people sat on wooden benches waiting for their own cases to be called. Some looked nervous, others impatient, but everyone shared the same understanding that the room ahead would be a place where decisions were made carefully. When we entered the courtroom, I noticed Daniel immediately. He was sitting at a table on the opposite side of the room beside two attorneys I had never met before. For a moment I studied his face quietly. He looked confident, almost rehearsed, as if he had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Our eyes met briefly, but neither of us spoke. The judge entered soon after, and the hearing began with a calm explanation of the issue being presented. Daniel's legal team spoke first. They described their concern about my ability to manage finances and daily responsibilities, repeating the same narrative Robert had warned me about earlier. They referenced conversations Daniel claimed to have observed and suggested that my memory had become unreliable. The tone was polite and measured, but the implication behind their argument was clear. They were asking the court to believe that I needed supervision. When they finished, Robert stood and addressed the judge with the same quiet confidence I had seen in his office meetings. Instead of responding with accusations, he began presenting documents. First came my financial records showing years of consistent management without missed payments or unusual transactions. Then he submitted the medical evaluation from the neurologist confirming my cognitive health. After that, he introduced the daily activity logs I had kept for weeks. Small but detailed records describing ordinary routines and responsibilities. Each document was simple on its own, yet together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Robert explained calmly that guardianship cases depend heavily on objective evidence, and in this situation the evidence demonstrated independence rather than incapacity. The judge listened carefully while reviewing the folder placed before him. The room remained quiet except for the soft turning of pages. I noticed Daniel watching from across the courtroom, his earlier confidence beginning to look less certain as the documents continued to appear one after another. After several minutes the judge spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than confrontational. He explained that guardianship is an extraordinary measure intended to protect individuals who truly cannot manage their lives. In cases where credible medical and financial records show the opposite, the court must approach such petitions with caution. The hearing was not yet finished, but the direction of the conversation had clearly shifted. As I sat there listening, I realized something important about the entire situation. Daniel had believed that building a story would be enough. What he had not understood was that in a courtroom stories always stand beside the evidence that supports them. And on that morning the evidence was beginning to speak very clearly. The judge remained silent for several moments after reviewing the documents Robert Hayes had presented. The courtroom felt unusually still during that pause, the kind of quiet that makes every small movement noticeable. I could hear the soft shuffle of papers, the distant hum of the air conditioning system, and the faint sound of traffic outside the courthouse windows. When the judge finally looked up, his attention moved slowly from the folder in front of him to the two tables on either side of the room. His voice was calm and deliberate when he began speaking again. He explained that guardianship cases require a careful balance between protecting vulnerable individuals and preserving the independence of those who remain capable of managing their own affairs. Because of that responsibility, the court must rely on credible medical evaluations and consistent evidence rather than assumptions or family disagreements. Daniel's attorneys responded by attempting to reinforce their earlier claims. They repeated the concerns Daniel had expressed about my memory, and suggested that my ability to function independently might decline in the near future. The argument was presented respectfully, but the judge listened with a thoughtful expression that suggested he was weighing each word against the documents already placed before him. When they finished speaking, Robert stood once more and calmly pointed out that the court had already been provided with a full neurological evaluation confirming that my cognitive health was well within the expected range for my age. He reminded the court that financial records, daily activity logs, and independent medical opinions all demonstrated the same conclusion. There was no credible indication that I was unable to manage my life. The judge reviewed the papers again, turning several pages slowly before closing the folder. Then he addressed the courtroom with a statement that carried quiet authority. He explained that guardianship is an extraordinary legal remedy, one that removes a person's ability to control their own property and personal decisions. Because of the seriousness of that action, the court must see clear and convincing evidence that such intervention is necessary. In this case, the documentation presented did not support that conclusion. The medical evaluation indicated normal cognitive functioning, and the financial records demonstrated consistent management of personal affairs. Without reliable evidence of incapacity, the petition could not meet the legal standard required to move forward. The judge then announced that the request for guardianship would be dismissed. The words were spoken calmly, almost matter of fact, but they carried the weight of a final decision. For a moment the room remained quiet as everyone absorbed what had just happened. I glanced across the courtroom toward Daniel. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by a tight expression that looked more uncertain than anything I had seen on his face that day. Robert placed a hand gently on the folder in front of us, and gave a small nod that required no explanation. The process we had prepared for was complete. As we gathered our documents and prepared to leave the courtroom, I felt an unexpected sense of calm rather than triumph. The situation had never been about winning an argument against my son. It had been about making sure that truth remained visible when the time came for someone else to decide what was real. And on that afternoon the truth had spoken clearly enough that no further explanation was necessary. When Robert and I stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the sky had cleared and the sunlight reflected softly off the windows of the surrounding buildings. People moved along the sidewalk carrying briefcases and coffee cups, completely unaware that one small family dispute had just ended inside the courtroom behind us. For a moment I stood at the top of the courthouse steps and simply breathed in the cool air. The tension that had followed me for weeks seemed to loosen quietly, not in a dramatic wave but in the slow way a long problem finally settles into clarity. Robert shook my hand before returning to his office and reminded me that the legal matter was officially finished. The court had dismissed the petition, and without credible evidence the same claim could not easily be brought again. I thanked him sincerely because preparation and patience had made all the difference. Then I walked alone toward the parking lot where my old Ford sedan was waiting in the same place I had left it earlier that morning. As I reached the car I noticed Daniel standing near the far end of the lot beside a dark sedan that must have belonged to one of his attorneys. For a moment neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt larger than the few yards of pavement separating our cars. When he finally looked in my direction his expression carried a mixture of frustration and something quieter that might have been uncertainty. I did not raise my voice or say anything dramatic. I simply told him that families sometimes lose their way when money changes the balance between people. What matters is whether someone chooses to correct that path or continue down it. Daniel did not respond immediately. He looked down at the ground for a moment, and then back toward the courthouse building behind us, as if reconsidering the steps that had led to this moment. I could not read his thoughts, and perhaps that was not my responsibility anymore. Some lessons only arrive when a person sees the consequences of their own decisions. I got into my car and drove home through the same familiar streets where I had lived for decades. The houses, the trees, the small grocery store on the corner all looked exactly as they had before this situation began. Yet something inside me felt different. Not stronger in a dramatic sense, just steadier. That evening I sat again on the back porch watching the sun settle behind the maple trees at the end of the street. The air was calm and the neighborhood quiet. I thought about how easily people believe that money has the power to transform lives overnight. In reality, money often does something simpler and more revealing. It exposes the character that was already there, waiting for the right circumstances to appear. My son had believed that $40 million gave him control over every part of his world, including the life of the man who raised him. But the truth is that control built on assumption rarely survives the moment it meets clear evidence. The court had not decided our story based on emotion or family loyalty. It had decided based on facts that could be seen and verified. And sometimes that is the most honest ending a difficult chapter can have. As the evening sky darkened above the trees, I realized something quietly reassuring. The situation had taken many weeks of patience and careful preparation, but in the end the outcome came down to something very simple. When truth is documented clearly enough, it eventually finds its own voice.